April 17th, 1961.
Y luchar de la única forma en que pueden llegar a vencer al enemigo.
The pre-dawn Caribbean swells washed against the sides of the LCI Blaga, its hull crammed not with cargo, but with the vanguard of a dream. Aboard, Brigade 2506, Cuban exiles trained, funded and directed by the United States, stared into the darkness where the swamps of Cuba's Zapata Peninsula coalesced out of the gloom. Their confidence was a palpable force, buoyed by the absolute assurance of their American handlers. They believed they were the spearhead of a popular uprising, the final, decisive stroke that would topple Fidel Castro and erase the communist stain from the hemisphere. The plan, codenamed Operation Zapata, was a masterpiece of self-deception, born in the conference rooms of Washington and the camps of Guatemala. The Central Intelligence Agency, the architect of this enterprise, had assured the young President John F. Kennedy that the landing would spark a spontaneous national revolt. Castro's regime, they claimed, was a house of cards. The exiles needed only to establish a beachhead, and the Cuban people would do the rest. What the men of Brigade 2506 did not know, what their CIA commanders had dismissed as an inconvenient detail, was that Castro's intelligence apparatus had been watching them for months. The dictator knew they were coming. As the first landing craft ground into the coral shore, the darkness was not empty. It was pregnant with waiting. The invasion began not with triumphant shouts, but with the sickening crunch of coral. The CIA had chosen the Bay of Pigs for its remote isolation, but its charts were a century out of date. The reefs, unseen in the darkness, ripped the hulls of the fragile landing craft, stranding vehicles and sowing chaos before a single shot was fired. The element of surprise, the invasion's most sacred asset, was drowning in the tepid salt water. From the moment the first flare illuminated the landing zone, the exiles were caught in a killing field. Castro's militias, far from being a disorganized rabble, were well-trained, well-armed, and fiercely motivated. They poured a torrent of fire onto the beaches, pinning the invaders against the sea. The spontaneous uprising was a phantom. The only locals who appeared were those sent by Castro to kill them. In Washington, a fog of unreality descended upon the White House. President Kennedy, the charismatic leader who had inherited this CIA operation from Eisenhower, received fragmented, optimistic reports that bore little resemblance to the catastrophe unfolding on the ground. The plan's first fatal flaw was now exposed. It was a secret everyone knew, an open conspiracy hamstrung by its own need for deniability. The second flaw was soon to follow. High above the beachhead, the sleek silhouettes of B-26 bombers, painted to look like defecting Cuban Air Force planes, began their crucial dawn sortie. Their mission was to destroy Castro's tiny air force on the ground, establishing absolute air superiority. But politics had gutted the mission. Fearful of exposing too much American involvement, Kennedy had authorized only half the planned strikes. The result was catastrophic. Castro's T-33 jet trainers and Sea Fury propellers, which the limited strikes had missed, became the sharks of the sky. They hunted the brigade's supply ships relentlessly. The Rio Escondido, loaded with 10 days of ammunition, most of the communications gear and the aviation fuel for the exiles' own planes, took a rocket hit and exploded in a fireball visible for miles. On the beaches, the exiles fought with a desperate, bewildered courage. They were young men, students, lawyers, farmers, who had lost their homeland to revolution and now believed they were reclaiming it. But their American-supplied rifles were no match for the Soviet-made tanks and artillery now rumbling toward them. Their beachhead, meant to be an expanding bridgehead, was shrinking by the hour into a bloody pocket of sand and despair. The third and most damning flaw was the betrayal of promises. The exiles had been told explicitly that if they faced overwhelming force, the full might of the United States Navy, the aircraft carriers and destroyers waiting just over the horizon, would intervene to save them. They fought on with this belief as their last crumbling pillar of hope. That hope was a lie. President Kennedy, staring into the abyss of a potential global confrontation with the Soviet Union, made the agonizing decision that would haunt his presidency. He gave the final, irrevocable order: the US Navy would not intervene. The jets from the USS Boxer would not fly. The Exile Brigade was on its own. The news, when it filtered down to the men on the beaches, was a different kind of weapon. more devastating than any shell. It shattered their spirit. They had been instruments of American policy, and now, having served their purpose as a deniable proxy, they were being sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical caution. For 3 days, the brigade fought a battle that was lost before it began. They were low on ammunition, surrounded by a force that grew larger with every passing hour, and abandoned by the superpower that had created them. Their commander, Pepe San Roman, sent increasingly desperate, then furious, radio messages to his CIA contacts. "Where is the air cover? You are destroying us! Do you care? Do you care?" The CIA and the White House were now prisoners of their own failed logic. The military men like General Maxwell Taylor saw the disaster for what it was and privately urged intervention. The diplomats warned of the immense propaganda defeat. Kennedy, trapped in the middle, could only watch as his first major foreign policy initiative disintegrated into a very public humiliation. On the final day, the exiles made a last hopeless stand at a place called Huron Beach. They were out of options and out of time. Castro's forces closed the noose, their Soviet tanks advancing methodically under the cover of their own dominant aircraft. The exiles' world had shrunk to the length of a rifle barrel. The surrender was not orderly. Men were captured as they tried to flee into the swamps, or as they swam out to sea in a desperate bid to reach the American ships they could see on the horizon. Of the 1,400 men of Brigade 2506, 114 were killed and over 1,100 were taken prisoner. They had not sparked a revolution. They had become Castro's trophies. In Havana, Fidel Castro was not just a victor. He was a prophet vindicated. He stood before microphones, his uniform still smudged with dirt from the front, and excoriated the Yankee imperialists. The failed invasion, which the CIA had intended to prove his weakness, instead cemented his power, uniting the Cuban people behind him against a common external enemy. In Washington, the recriminations began immediately. President Kennedy, his youthful confidence shaken, stood before the American people and took public responsibility. "Victory has 100 fathers," he said, his voice heavy, "but defeat is an orphan." Privately, he was furious, feeling he had been misled by the CIA's experts. The CIA, for its part, felt betrayed by the political leadership. They had built the weapon, they argued, only to have the trigger finger seized at the last moment. The Bay of Pigs exposed a fundamental dysfunction in the national security apparatus, a disconnect between intelligence planning and political will. The human cost was measured in the grim prisons of Cuba. For 20 months, the survivors of Brigade 2506 languished in squalid cells, subjected to interrogation and public ridicule. They were the living ghosts of a failed policy, a constant, painful reminder to the Kennedy administration of its first and most spectacular defeat. Their eventual release in December 1962 was not an act of Cuban mercy, but the result of a cold, hard bargain. The United States paid a ransom of $53 million in food and medicine, a tacit admission of its responsibility, and a desperate bid to close a shameful chapter. The geopolitical consequences were immediate and profound. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, watching the American debacle, drew a critical conclusion. The young American president was intelligent but indecisive, someone who could be pushed. This perception would set the stage for the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War just 18 months later, the Cuban Missile Crisis. For Fidel Castro, the victory was the ultimate legitimization. It allowed him to fully purge his government of dissenters and formally declare Cuba a socialist state, cementing his alliance with the Soviet Union. The American failure had directly created the very thing it sought to prevent, a firmly entrenched Soviet-aligned communist state just 90 miles from Florida. The invasion also poisoned the well of US-Latin American relations for a generation. It was seen as proof of Yankee imperialism, a heavy-handed attempt to dictate the destiny of a sovereign nation. The image of the United States as a champion of democracy was severely tarnished. Within the CIA, the Bay of Pigs led to a profound internal crisis. Director Alan Dulles and his deputy were forced to resign. The agency's paramilitary division was scaled back, and its operations were subjected to much stricter White House oversight, though a culture of aggressive covert action had been established, one that would re-emerge in Vietnam and elsewhere. For President Kennedy, the failure was a brutal but invaluable lesson. He learned to trust his own skepticism over the assuredness of the experts. He revamped his decision-making process, relying more heavily on ad hoc committees and demanding rigorous debate. a style that would prove crucial during the missile crisis. The men of Brigade 2506, when they finally returned to the United States, were hailed as heroes by the Cuban exile community, but they were also broken men. They had lost their country twice, first to Castro and then to the failed promise of its liberation. Their trust in the United States had been irrevocably shattered. The perfect failure was not the result of a single error, but a cascade of them. Faulty intelligence that mistook wishful thinking for fact, a flawed military plan based on outdated geography, and a complete misreading of the political landscape, and a fatal disconnect between the planners who promised success and the president who bore the ultimate responsibility. The invasion revealed the limits of American power in the Cold War. It demonstrated that money, training, and weaponry could not manufacture a popular revolution where none existed. It showed that covert action, when it failed, carried a diplomatic price far higher than its planners ever anticipated. The beaches of the Bay of Pigs today are quiet, a tourist destination for Canadians and Europeans. A small museum sits at Giron, its exhibits curated by the Cuban government to celebrate the first great defeat of Yankee imperialism in Latin America. The rusting hulks of a few landing craft still protrude from the water, their metal skeletons slowly returning to the sea. In Miami's Little Havana, the legacy is different but no less potent. The members of Brigade 2506, now old men, gather for reunions. They display their flag, a testament to a Cuba that exists now only in memory. Their story is one of courage and betrayal, a central founding myth of the exile community's enduring resentment and determination. Historians would later mine the archives, uncovering the full depth of the miscalculation. They found that Castro's popularity, while not universal, was strong enough to withstand the exile challenge. The CIA's own pre-invasion polls had hinted at this, but the data was ignored in favour of a more convenient narrative. The Bay of Pigs stands as a timeless case study in the perils of groupthink. In the sealed environment of the CIA, the plan became an article of faith. Dissenting voices were muted, inconvenient facts were rationalised away. The agency had fallen in love with its own creation. It also exposed the inherent moral hazard of proxy warfare. The United States had empowered these exiles, given them a cause and a mission, but when the mission proved too costly, it cut them loose. The human beings at the heart of the operation became expendable assets. The aftermath saw a strange and poignant reconciliation. President Kennedy, perhaps burdened by guilt, met with the released prisoners in Miami in 1962. He stood before them and accepted their brigade flag, a gesture of contrition and respect. "I can assure you," he told them, "that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana." That promise remains unfulfilled. The flag resides today in a museum in Miami, a silent symbol of a broken pledge and a conflict frozen in time. The dream of Brigade 2506 outlived the men, becoming part of the long, unresolved story of US-Cuba relations. The true lesson of the Bay of Pigs is not about military tactics, but about the nature of power and the fallibility of judgment. It is a story of how good intentions, when married to arrogance and a refusal to confront uncomfortable truths, can pave the road to a spectacular, predictable disaster. The laughter died on the beaches of Giron, but not the legacy. In the clear, shallow waters of the bay, where the coral slowly consumes the rusted iron of a failed invasion, lies the wreckage of certainty. A permanent reminder that the most dangerous assumptions are those we never think to question.